morning I take my little puppers for a 10, 15-minute walk down the block and back. Basically, the way down the block, he's barking like mad. He's full of piss and vinegar. He's just like, I'm angry at the world. I've got so much to say. And then the way back, because he's a dachshund and he has 3-inch long legs, he's like, oh, God, I'm exhausted. Oh, my God. Can we please get to a bowl of water? And what's great is it calms him down. Like, he goes from being like, I'm going to fight the world to, I just want to sit. Can I sit here while you draw? That's fine. I'll just sit down. But every morning on our way out, it's so unfortunate that it's on the outbound trip, there is a big fat Persian cat that sits right at the edge of his driveway, or her driveway, I have no idea. And it's a big fluffy thing with one of those faces that's just like, yeah, hello, that kind of thing.
Yeah, Persians have that way of looking at you.
Yeah, Ollie is barking like mad at it, and this cat could care less. It's like... And so, for whatever reason, my mind always flashes. You know how you and I do Paul Lynde's voice every once in a while?
Yeah.
My mind always flashes with this cat that it's like, he's just sitting there, and this dog is actively barking at him like 20 inches away, and he's like, oh, honey, I'm not going to move for you. What do you think this is? I don't move for anything less than 5 pounds. Because Ollie's this tiny little dog.
And then you should see me move.
And then watch me move. Oh, honey, the only thing threatened here is your own ego. You're not scaring me. I mean, the cat could care less. It is the most Paul Lynde cat I've ever seen.
It's a very Paul Lynde cat. That's a good way of looking at it.
I kind of want to take a photo of it on tomorrow's walk and share it with the Patreon audience, because you'll see this face is very much like circle takes a square.
Next time you come back, bring a friend.
You and what army, little dog? Anyway. No real point to that. Just wanted to share the Paul Lynde cat in my neighborhood.
Listen, any excuse to do a Paul Lynde impersonation is a good excuse as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it was basically just my excuse. You're right. I just wanted to do Paul Lynde.
Just wanted to get it out of your system. That's okay.
That's right. Well... Look, little dog, let's start the show. All right, well, on that note, I'm going to say hello, everybody, and welcome to ComicLab, the show about making comics.
And making a living from comics. I'm Brad Geiger, editor of webcomics.com and cartoonist of Evil Inc.
And I'm his friend Dave Kellett, referencer of timely comedians like Paul Lynde, who everybody still knows and loves.
Yeah.
And there's like a 20-year-old listening to the show going, who the hell is Paul Lynde?
Who the hell is Paul Lynde? Do yourself a favor and go to YouTube. I swear to God, it'll be a time sink. You'll spend the next half an hour.
It would, actually. I'm the cartoonist of Drive in Sheldon and the co-director of Strip.
And this week's Hour of Comics Advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/ComicLab. So Dave, let's talk comics.
Let's talk comics, my friend. So we had a big fun question come in today, Brad, about the top 3 comics that are our favorites. Do you want to read that one for us, Bradley?
Absolutely. This one comes in from Curious Borg, and it says, hi, guys. What would each of you consider the top 3 best all-around comic strips of all time? The ones that influenced you when you were getting started and never left you feeling nonplussed. Dave, you don't want to feel nonplussed when you're reading a comic strip.
Oh, honey, I'm always feeling nonplussed. Best 3 comic strips. Okay, so let's make this even more interesting. Let's divide this up, because I think it's fun to say what are the best 3 comic strips on a personal level.
Yeah.
And then maybe it might be fun, Brad, to throw a wrinkle onto Curious Borg's question and say, what are the best 3 like newspaper comics of the 20th century or of all time, or like the most impactful,
I'm glad you said newspaper, because let's narrow this down even further so we don't, kind of commit a commission of omission, or you know what I mean? A sin of omission. In other words, we got to take comic books out.
There's a man trained by nuns, a sin of omission.
It's commission and omission. Let's take comic books out, and let's take other comics out, like magazine comics, because I've got a feeling putting Charles Addams into this mix is a little bit unfair, although leaving him out would be kind of a crime as well. So let's stick to newspaper comic strips. We will include panels. Do you agree? Like single panel comics.
I think it's fair to just say newspaper comics. So any panel or strip, because I think that gets to the spirit of what Curious Borg was asking, which is what are our favorite 3 He said comic strips, but I think most people would be okay if we said newspaper strips.
Yeah.
Because you and I, Brad, as panel cartoonists, or sorry, not as multiple panel cartoonists, you and I have both done strips that are single panel.
Right.
So there's an argument that the platform is somewhat similar. Anyway, all right. So my top three. So this dates me also. We should acknowledge this right up front.
Oh, yeah.
That you can't help but be influenced by the time that you grew up reading. And I'll tell you why I say that. So my top three are probably going to be Bloom County for writing, Calvin and Hobbes for art, and Far Side for the sheer surrealness and delightfulness that is Far Side. It was so out of left field. Those would probably be my top three. I might be able to roll in one or two other ones, but if I had to make a Sophie's choice, it'd probably be those three. How about you? What would your three be?
You are completely wrong. I can't tell you how wrong you are.
Okay.
The three that should be in your list are The Far Side for surrealness, Bloom County for its writing, and Calvin and Hobbes for its art. You had you had the order all wrong. The only thing I can argue with you, and it's a total, I'm not being serious. The only thing I could possibly argue is the order. Other than that, my top three is exactly the same as your top three. All I have to do is look at my library behind me, and it's the books that I bought when I was a young person. It was all Far Side books, Bloom County books, and Calvin and Hobbes. There's nothing else, from that formative period of my life. There's nothing else that's on my shelf, and yeah, I can't even think of anybody that I would even come close to for my personal top three.
Now, here's where it gets interesting because you and I both put Bloom County on that list.
Yeah,
but I think we've said on other shows, no comic strip has aged as poorly from its initial high to how it reads to a new person today than Bloom County. Like, that one was so of its age. It's like when you and I, Brad, who did not come of age at the same time as Pogo. Right. When we sit and read Pogo, we're like, I mean, it's a nicely drawn tree. I like the swamp. That's a real nice swamp. But
great ink work.
Yeah. I don't really get this Lyndon Johnson joke, but all right.
I can't read it for shit because of all the phonetical spellings, and he went into all this trouble to write accents and stuff like that. And then God help you if he starts playing with typography. You couldn't read the strip. So again, Geiger's law. If you can't read the strip, nobody's going to read your strip. But Pogo is exactly.
I was arguing that Pogo was one of the bigger ones of the 20th century, and I love how your attitude is like, you can't read the damn thing. I don't know.
No.
It's good for parrot filler.
Your central point is absolutely right in that Pogo, like Bloom County, was of its time and in its time.
Yeah.
And in that time, I've got to assume that people were reading that strip differently than we read strips today, and that it hit with people. And for whatever reason, today, I look at that and I'm like, I'm not going to work that hard to read a strip. Why? Because in the 60s, you were competing with a dozen other comics. That was whatever your newspaper comic strip or whatever your newspaper comics page carried. Today, you're competing with 500,000 other comics. So if your comic can't be read, nobody's going to waste time trying to decipher it. They've got 1 million others they can read. Whereas Pogo, in its time, was only competing with a much smaller cadre of strips. And so you spend a little bit more time with it. You weren't being pulled away by cat videos.
Well, let's take a minute to argue what the three best historical comic strips or newspaper comics were. Because I think you and I, it's very noticeable, both of us left Peanuts off the list.
Yep.
And that is inarguably one of the most influential comics of all time, if not the most influential comic of all time.
Yeah. You cannot not have a strip of influential comics or a list without mentioning Peanuts. However, by the time I was exposed to Peanuts, Schultz had already had his heyday. And at this point, he had become so recognizable that his punchlines weren't funny because we were so familiar with his humor. We had kind of gotten into his head and we could anticipate the punchlines.
Yeah.
We knew what kind of stuff was coming. It wasn't a surprise because he was so popular. He was a victim of his own success. We weren't surprised by him anymore because we had gotten right inside of his head with him. But you can't leave him off a list of influential comics because everybody was influenced by Charles Schulz.
Yeah, and style-wise, and in terms of what he did for comics in general, like you look at pre-war comics and what they were, and then what Schulz did and how he changed the game. It's so different. And so part of it, like you and I came of age in the 70s and 80s, and someone in the 90s, and so like you said, Schulz was already. Everyone had caught up to Schulz by that point too, which is another way of looking at. Like he had climbed a mountain and had pegged in so much higher than everybody else. And then it took a couple decades, frankly. The 60s were not strong for comics. The 70s were a lot of people were drawing in Sharpies. And then the 80s comics got really good again. But by the time we came of age, there was a lot of really interesting comics being made that were building off of what Schulz had already established and discovered, you know? And so for us, he was less groundbreaking than what he truly was in comics. The appearance of him was less groundbreaking. So let's put Peanuts on the top list. Who else would you put 20th century on the top comics of all time?
Well, it's another one of these that never really hit with me, but it's undeniable the ripple effect that this person had on newspaper comic strips in general, and that's George Harriman's Crazy Cat.
Oh, yeah. Well, the thing is, now everyone knows Crazy Cat. It did not have that big an audience for a big chunk of the century, you know?
Right.
And
but
yet,
other
every
cartoonists were looking at this work, and they were just their eyes were spinning around in their head. And that goes not only that, but I pulled up because this also. I don't know whether you saw this come across your social media, but since it's Black History Month, there's a lot of posts going around that says, "Oh, by the way, George Harriman was black. He was part of this whole cadre of cartoonists that came through, and he had to kind of hide his identity and pass as white, but he was really black." And I found this great New York Times article that talks all about it, and it says, I'm just going to quote for a second. A quarter century after his death, a birth certificate was found stating that Harriman was born, quote, colored, unquote, to Creole parents in the 19th century. Clearly, this is something that he would have had to have lived with in that time, and yet, if racism had blocked us from this person's work, the ripple effect of what he did would be completely lost on us.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he, again, like you trace every Haight-Ashbury comic back to Harriman. You can trace every indie comic, everything that appears in the Comics Journal or at SPX. Right. All those comics owe George Harriman so much. And also the sheer goofy and delightfulness that is Crazy Cat was so groundbreaking and fun. And like, we all owe a debt to that. So yeah, I will agree with you. The Crazy Cat should probably be on that list. So the third one, what would we pick? Okay, I'm going to propose one, and I don't think you'll agree with it. But it's George McManus's Bringing Up Father in the 20s and 30s, and I'll tell you why.
You are such a nut for that strip, and I know you've got an original hanging in your studio, and it's another one that I'm like, why does he like this one so much?
Well, I'll tell you. So I have uselessly 2 master's degrees in comics history, right? And I say uselessly because what do they qualify me for, Brad? I can flip a burger. There's nothing. Yeah. What are you going to do with a master? I got 2 master's degrees in comics. Like, what a dummy. I wasn't smart enough to stop at one. I went and got another one. Yeah. So anyway, in studying 1920s and 1930s comics, you realize that most of them are terrible. And I don't just say that like from being snarky. Like, they're not good. They're not good. They were drawn quickly, composed quickly, written on the fly, and they were BS for kids, basically, right?
Right.
But then there were a few cartoonists that just elevated the game, and George Harriman was one. By the way, there's a great biography about George Harriman that you should check out. It's been out now about 4 or 5 years. But anyway, okay, that's a great one to read. Anyway, what I was going to say is George McManus, Bringing Up Father, you look at his line art, and it's this Art Nouveau line art that is gorgeous, and it's taking a page out of French architectural drawing and also this line art style that no one else was even attempting. And it was so good, and yet at the same time, it talked about the immigrant experience in America, and I think it's just an incredible strip and had an incredible impact on pre-war cartoonists in terms of what was possible. You know, like you didn't have
Mhm.
to just crap it out. You could draw an incredible comic strip, you know?
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. I'll give you you're bringing up father. I'm going to say that you've got to make room for Gary Larson's Far Side in there, and it's got to be in your top three because of the fact that it was so recognizable and so much of a touchstone in newspaper comics that every single page every single panel comic that came after it was called a Far Side ripoff.
Yeah.
You couldn't do Speed Bump, for example, which is brilliant.
Yeah.
It never not funny. You couldn't do Bizarro, which is
Oh,
also takes the whole art form to another level.
Bizarro.
That guy is incredible.
We should have Dan on the show. Dan is also one of the funniest human beings alive. He's so
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, and the thing I love about the Bizarro comic is that they can take a very uh, kind of low level joke, like they can take something that if you just wrote it down and put it on a piece of paper, it's at a 3. The punchline is at a 3. But by the time that panel is done and processed and put out in front of you, they can sell the heck out of a joke. You know, they can
Right,
take
right.
something that anybody else it would be meh, and they can make it a home run. It's really phenomenal.
Yeah, I am in awe of what he's able to do. I mean, I know he only does Sundays now, but
Yeah,
I'm still in awe of what he's one of my favorites. Well, so here's the thing. I'll see your Far Side,
yeah.
but I'll counter that maybe. So let's look at it this way: 100 years out, 200 years out, what's going to still be read, Far Side or Calvin and Hobbes? Do you think?
I thought you were going to say Far Side because if you're going to start using that yardstick, where do we put Bringing Up Father?
Listen, it's 100 years on, and I'm still reading. I'm still reading it, Brad.
You're
Brad,
like that
how
reader.
dare you?
You're like
I still
that listener that comes in and says, "How come you keep saying RSS is dead? I'm still using it." Yeah,
I'm still
okay.
reading a strip from 1920, Brad.
Yeah.
No, you're right. Okay, so
But,
Pete,
but
I mean,
I don't want to derail you because it's a fascinating question. Of the two, Calvin and Hobbes or Far Side, which is still going to be getting read in the next what? What do you say? 50 years?
I'd say 100 years out. Like what? 100 years out.
100 years out,
I would
what's still
argue
getting
that
read?
Calvin and Hobbes will still be read in a higher percentage than Far Side.
Wow. Let me think about that.
And I say that. Can I tell you what reinforces that thought?
Go ahead.
There is not a kid growing up in America that at some point in their childhood does not read Calvin and Hobbes.
You're right about that.
And the same numbers are not present for Far Side. So 100 years from now, it'll still be read.
That's very true. Like my kids, I mean, obviously my kids read both growing up, but when I would go to school, and it would be held out. In other words, when I'd go to school, the kids there knew Calvin and Hobbes. They did not know Far Side.
Right.
And
right.
forget about Bloom County. That was a pointless struggle. But you're right. And if that keeps going generation after generation, and so here's the part of it. So a couple weeks ago, I said, listen, in a comic, the writing is always more important than the art. And I really truly believe that. However, when it comes to something like this, like you've elevated, now you've brought your entire art form to the top of the top percent, in which obviously both the art and the writing were incredibly strong. Now I'm going to argue that maybe part of what keeps Calvin and Hobbes in front of kids is that when I look at Far Side, it looks very dated. Even the approach of Far Side, the zip-a-tone, everything about Far Side looks very dated when I look at it. Whereas Calvin and Hobbes, when I look at it, it's still fresh as the day I first saw it. And I wonder if that isn't part of what's keeping its longevity so strong in younger viewers.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Well, and also, I've talked about this before, and I think I even mentioned to Bill one time, like he consciously kept anything timely out of Calvin and Hobbes, you know?
Yes.
Like there's nothing that's going to date. I mean, aside from maybe a television in the background or a telephone, the shape of a telephone, there's nothing that's going to date in a Watterson Calvin and Hobbes.
But that's true of Far Side too.
No, Far Side is much more of its time.
Really?
If you look back to it, like the animal ones will be timeless, but there's some technology ones where you're like, oh, this didn't
Yeah.
age well.
Yeah.
But I that's to no fault. I continue to think he's a genius. But what's interesting about this conversation, let's not go too much longer about this, but what's interesting is who we did not even attempt to include on this list that were giants of 20th century comics. Gasoline Alley, I could give less of a shit about Gasoline Alley, and that thing was gigantic, Brad. Right? That thing ran for decades. Popeye, not going to mention it. Not even on my list.
No.
Little Abner, that thing was such a hit, and I do not like Little Abner. That to me, I could care less about Little Abner.
Even I've tried to get into Little Abner, but I'm like, I really, you hear what a hit it was, and it had its own Broadway play, and so on and so forth. And I've picked up collections, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to really get into this. I bet you I can learn a lot. And no, it's impenetrable for me. I can't really get into it at all. It's not for me.
Yeah. So other big ones of the 20th century that we didn't mention. Your personal favorite, Barney Google, with the googly eyes. I mean, he literally had jazz songs written about him that were hits and had product placement. Also, Hush Puppy had massive product placement. No one talks about it anymore. It's already been forgotten.
What about Nancy? Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy is oftentimes referenced and had a little bit of a bump a couple years ago when they brought a new team in that really gave it an update and a makeover. But even now, a couple years after that, that's kind of settled out. You don't see it being shared quite as much. You don't see it pushed as much. But even without that, taking the original Ernie Bushmiller Nancy, I don't think it's it gets brought up to that level.
No, it doesn't. You know what, though? One that we didn't mention that you could arguably say had a huge impact on the 20th century and still is worth somewhat mentioning is Blondie. And I'll tell you why it's worth mentioning. Not for its impact on comics, because it was always capably drawn, but it's not, groundbreaking. Not for its writing, because it was always sort of like tropes of, I just want to sleep and my wife is nagging me, that kind of comic. But here's where I think it did have an impact on the 20th century. 30 to 40 years of American television sitcoms are basically Blondie, if you think about it.
Oh,
they all stole that model.
Yeah.
They all stole the model of the, put upon husband he just wants to sleep. And this wife is but meanwhile, the wife's totally capable and lovely and wonderful, but the husband's just a piece of shit that wants to sit on the couch all day. But that's kind of the sitcom for all of post-war America. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That Blondie comic strip.
So do we have to talk about Beetle Bailey at some point?
No, we don't. We can skip that one entirely.
I'm gonna throw a caveat in there, not for Beetle Bailey, but for Mort Walker, and I'm gonna tell you why. Because all of a sudden, with Mort Walker, you get somebody that turns comic strips into this whole other thing, turns them into like an assembly line. So, because you've got to remember, Beetle Bailey spun off High and Lois.
Oh, and also the best comic strip title of all time, Boner's Ark, Brad.
Boner's Ark. I was going to say Boner's Ark. And one of the first preceding Checkerboard Nightmare, preceding Greystone Inn, you had Sam's strip, which was a self-referential newspaper comic. In other words, the characters knew that they were in a comic strip.
He also wrote I forget the title, but it was something like the Encyclopedia of Comicana. It's like which basically taking a fun look at how a comic strip is built. And he tried to build the Museum of Comics down in Miami, I think it was, which even though it failed was an incredible effort. So I will give you credit that as a person he brought a lot to the craft.
Right.
But anyway, so I don't know that it's hard to limit it down to 3, but I think Peanuts is definitely on that list, and maybe you and I could split the difference and say Far Side, Calvin and Hobbes are on that list. I don't know who I would put as third. That's interesting. In 20th
at third
comics.
place, the field widens right out at that point.
Yeah, you get a lot. There's a lot to argue. I mean, you could say, even Lynn Johnson with For Better For Worse, that was a really impactful strip of its time.
Geez, you can't discount Lynn Johnson, especially what she brought to serialized comics.
For what Kathy Geiswhite did too for comics. Yeah, I mean, both Kathy and Lynn were amazing. So yeah, and then also Garfield, basically the latter stage of like what
Oh,
did Garfield achieve in merchandising? Like Garfield did what Walt Disney did, but with comic strips. And
how did we get all this way without mentioning Garfield? That's a crime. That's really a shortcoming of this conversation. And I swear to God, it's a holdover over this whole thing where Garfield got criticized in the late '80s for being too marketed, and meanwhile, Garfield and Peanuts were marketed about the same. But for some reason, Jim Davis got such slack for it, maybe because he was very successful and people were jealous. But there's a holdover to that whole thing that the after effect is we still, even you and I, who are, let's face it, very smart people, didn't even put Garfield into the running. That's a crime. That would boo on us.
well, no, and listen, you won't get any argument from me in terms of what Jim was able to do on the business side of comics.
Yeah.
Was groundbreaking. Like he took everything that Hush Puppy ever did, everything that Peanuts ever did, everything that Hello Kitty ever did, and said, "Hold my beer. I'm gonna do this one better." And he did. And there, you have to give him credit for that about what he was able to do as a single person managing his own business and making it happen. So yeah. Anyway, we've really summed up all of 20th Century Comics and have not found a satisfactory third comic for the most historically important.
Yeah. This is like Gilligan's Island when they changed the opening credits and they got all the way down to those last two people and they just said, and all the rest.
And the rest, yeah, exactly.
So we've got who? Charles Schultz and Bill Watterson and all the rest.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, if you had to summarize 20th Century Comics, you could probably go Sparky, Bill, and everybody else. Good job, everybody. We did a good 20th century. There we go.
Everybody else gets a participation trophy.
Yeah, the small little soccer gold thing. Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we've recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics.
Dave, I've got a question from one of our $5 level Patreon backers, and this is really interesting. I'm going to be very interested to hear what you've got to say about this. This comes from Art of Kai, and this person says, "Do you think there's such a thing as being too niche or too niche, whichever pronunciation you prefer? Is there such a thing as being too niche? My subject matter is a somewhat obscure, very traditional, very cultural sport. Additionally, not all practitioners of the sport appreciate the arts. So my work is a Venn diagram of art appreciators and fans of that specific sport. Is it too narrow?"
Wow. I like what's interesting about this question is the emphasis on very cultural, very specific, very niche sport. And I'm wondering if it's like that weird, what's that horse sport that they only play on the northern steppes of Mongolia or Kazakhstan? What is that sport where they have
The only horse sport I know is polo.
Yeah,
and
polo.
Water polo. Except
I'm just trying to think of like how niche of a sport could you like? Is it Canadian curling? Which like it's not like anybody in Texas is curling.
This sounds the first sport that came up to my mind would be cricket.
Yeah, cricket. Although cricket's a global. Maybe it's what's the one they do in India with the elephant polo? That's amazing. Like, let's combine everything we love about polo, but also 14,000-pound animals.
Is that really a thing, elephant polo?
I thought it was. Maybe that's just me inventing that in my mind. Anyway, so okay, let's get to the central question though. Can you get too niche? And I think the answer is, provided you do it well and capture the spirit of that crowd, in a way
Mhm.
that is true to that crowd, I think you can actually make a lovely place for yourself in the world by appealing to a niche. Brad, what do you think?
I think you said the key words there, as long as it's good. And here's the thing that worries me is that this person in writing their question makes a big logical assumption that there's actually a double assumption happening there. Uh, Additionally, not all practitioners of the sport appreciate the arts. So your expectation there is that the person who likes the sport is going to be drawn to your strip for the art of it, not the content. When in reality, it's the opposite. It's somebody that's, and I'll get into that, I guess, a little bit more. So somebody that's drawn to that strip is going to be drawn to it because it's a comic about this sport that they love. It doesn't
Right.
really have anything about the art necessarily. It has everything to do with the content. And if the content is good, then they're gonna flock to it. Here's an example going way back. So I took one of these courses and it was in wildlife illustration. And I
What?
thought, yeah, yeah,
I
it
did
was
not
this
know
was
this about you. What?
way back when I was a teenager. I took a wildlife illustration,
Can
and
I? Okay, hold on. We got to pause there because you can't just drop that in conversation and not comment on it. If someone said to me, "Who among all your cartooning friends is the best at drawing wildlife illustrations?" You know who I would not
I-
pick? I would not pick like Brad. If there's one person that knows how to draw an antelope, it's Brad Geiger. Oh, I tell
no.
you what, you need a wait a minute. I was gonna make a joke and I stopped myself on a different animal. All right, so let's move
Now I
on.
got to know what the joke was.
Nope, nope. I'm not making that joke. I'm not. I'm self-editing that joke. Nope, 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 nope,
Well,
nope.
so here's the thing, and specifically, this was like illustrations of pheasant and fox. It was all hunting related, and
Oh,
I thought, oh, my teenage brain was like, okay, you're doing these illustrations for like Field and Stream magazine, right? Who's going to really care whether you've got the right number of stripes on a blue jay, right? These are hunters, right? They're to a teenage Brad Geiger. These are troglodytes. What do they know about anything?
right.
And what I found out very quickly is that these tough and burly hunters not only knew how many stripes was on the ass of a blue jay, they cared because it was important to them because it was their thing. They knew how many stripes was on a tail of a blue jay. They knew the right feather patterns for a pheasant. And
Yep.
if you got that stuff wrong, they were really the first ones to point it out because this was their passion, because they were passionate about the content.
That's why I say at the beginning, I said, if you do it well and if you
Yeah.
appeal to the true spirit of that community, because um, to Brad's point, there's a certain amount of like fetishizing the details of like say like whatever this sport is, if it's curling, if it's cricket, if it's English darts, whatever the specific cultural sport is that you're referencing. I wish they would have referenced it because
Yeah.
we would have made hay out of that. But anyway, um, let's say it's English darts. Like
Yeah.
the way that you hold the dart, the look of the feathering on the dart, the way the dart flies through the air before it hits the board, right? All those fetishizing moments as an artist, if you can make that come alive because you yourself love it,
Yeah.
honest to God, Brad, even if an English darts loving audience doesn't love comics per se,
Mhm.
they might really get drawn to you because it's both good and because you know the culture and the community and the fetishizing that goes on in that culture of the little details, the minutia of that sport, don't you think?
Right. Yeah, and not only that, but I think so. Let's say here's another thing that I think is happening. This person is doing. Let's keep the English darts thing going, and they've done their strip about the little feathers or whatever you call those things on the end of the dart. They've done the strip about the bullseye. They've done the strip about all of the details about the sport, and now maybe they're feeling a little bit like, now what? And I think, again, I think if you're going to be doing this and doing it long term, you've got to make the sport the arena but you've got to do the writing about what happens in the arena. In other
Bingo,
words,
bingo.
remember
Yep.
when we had Ngozi on the show,
Mm-hmm.
and Ngozi was doing a comic about gay hockey players, right? And it was very much about hockey. But the thing that brought people to that comic in droves wasn't that Ngozi drew pucks really well.
Right. It was the fullness of the story, right? It was the full world around that
Right.
moment.
And the fact that this whole story was built in an arena that these people also loved.
Right.
And that you could have a very niche thing like gay hockey players.
Right.
But people loved it, not only because now the Venn diagram is working in your favor. Now she's bringing in people because they got in the door because they loved hockey. And all of a sudden, holy shit, there's a really good story going on here.
Right,
And then she had other people coming in who said, there's a really good story going on here. Man, and this is hockey. Wow.
Right.
Now,
exactly.
Now I'm learning about hockey. Yeah, I think the Venn diagram works in your favor. I think you're looking at it completely wrong.
No, I think they're just questioning, like, is it a bad move to go too small a crowd? And here's what I think Brad would argue, and Brad and I would argue, is that when you appeal to a group, it doesn't matter any group, but keeping it on sports, I guarantee you there are 20,000 communities and forums and Facebook groups and I don't even chat rooms where they're already talking about it. They're already passionate about it. And so even if some guy in Southeast London doesn't really read comics, doesn't love comics, but you do an English darts comic, it's going to get mentioned on a forum, and he's going to go, hello, and that, by the way, was the worst accent ever. But it was. But what I'm getting at is they're going to discover it, and because to Brad's point, it triggers a passion that they already have.
Yeah,
it'll widen their world to include it, and I think with great love they'll widen their world to include it, even if they're not a comics person.
As a matter of fact, this comes around to another Patreon backer that I did I actually did a consultation with. Separately, obviously,
okay.
And this person was very interested in a fetish that I had never even heard of. Right, it was a whole branch of sexual exploration that I was unaware of. And this person said, "Is this too much of a niche? Is this too niche? Is this too small?" And I'm like, "No, this is an opportunity. You're going to be one of maybe 3 people doing content in comics, specifically comics content about this fetish. I said, drive right down the middle of that lane. This is a fantastic opportunity. And every time I check in on this person, they're doing really interesting things. And I think they're building something that's going to be very, very good and is clearly fulfilling. But at no point did I say that's too small of a niche. I said, this is fantastic. You don't have any competition. People
Right.
who are interested in this thing are going to gravitate towards you because you're one of the few people doing it.
And I want to say that Brad was being too polite to mention it, but I want to say, as the person who had reached out to him to ask that question, I want to thank him for giving me the green light to do my B. Arthur fan site and website.
Yeah.
I don't advertise it much, but it's out there if you want to search it. Dave Kellett, B. Arthur. Go ahead, Brad. What was that?
That's bringing up mental images that you don't even want to know about.
All right, let's move along. So I think, like, to my point, a couple shows back, you could do a comic about Victorian fashions, and if you love it and do it well and swim in that community, you will find your tribe, and your tribe will find you. And if nothing else, God forbid you enjoy doing a comic about a thing that you love. Let's forget building an audience, forget making a money. How wonderful to create a topic that you love. And so I think go for it. Don't you think, Brad? I think that's a good button on that one.
Absolutely. So, Dave, I've got another $5 level Patreon question for you. This one comes in from our Patreon backer, Susan Marks, who says, "Hi, perfect timing. I'm relatively new to cartooning, but I'm thinking the work I'm starting may be something I'd like to share." Dave, do you remember that feeling?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm loving this question already. So how do I share it? Via the web? Look for an anthology? Self-publish? What choices should I make now in setting up my digital files? And how can I design it for a vertical feed as well as a page format? Thanks for always making me laugh and be smarter. Dave, this person is in the honeymoon period. They've just started doing comics. They're starting to get really excited. And Susan is saying, I want to do it all. I'm open to anthologies, self-publishing, put it on a website, and I want to do vertical and page, and I want to make sure my files are set up right. And I don't know that we can answer all the questions that Susan has, but let's point this person in a right direction, because they're super excited to put this out into the world, and let's put them out in a good way.
Well, here's what the delightful image that I'm seeing from Susan. She's just got off on a 1955 bus from Des Moines, and she's in the big city. She's in New York, and she's like, Broadway, here I come. And she throws this straw hat, and she's like, Broadway, look out for Susan, da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
If I can make it here, I can make it anywhere.
Hey, that was almost the song. That was great, Brad. You're really making progress in those classes. That was great. Hey, guys, you remember that song, Broadway, if I can make it here, then I can make it anywhere. Da-da-da. Anyway,
she takes her hat off and flings it up into St. Paul Square.
She's got like a little kind of a straw boater suitcase next to her that's like one of those ones they only made in the 40s. Anyway, all right. So, Susan, this is all good questions. These I can read through the lines of the excitement and you're like, which way do I go? Just point me in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
So let's establish some basic things. If this is a comic that's going to be short form, because you had mentioned the word anthology, if it's a short form, that's a very different path than if this is a title or a project that you want to work on long term, like say for 3, 5, 10 years, right?
Yeah.
So let's assume that this is a long form project that you want to do. I think both Brad and I would say start getting it up on the web. Start sharing it. You can obviously take a couple weeks, couple months to start establishing characters, establishing looks, getting all that done. But once you're ready, once you've produced a page, get it up on the web, because getting it out there will start creating a sense of accountability. You've got one page up, you got to get the second page up. Oh, you got page 1 and 2 up. Now you got to get page 3 up, right? And so you'll start getting that in there. As far as you start to draw, one thing that Brad and I will always recommend is don't forget to draw at 300 DPI or larger, and at a file size that's suitable for eventual print.
Yes.
And by that I mean, like, you're creating for the web now, but help Susan in the future out and give her files that are 300 DPI or higher, and at least page size dimensions or slightly higher. And the reason why I say slightly higher is you can always come down. So if you want to draw at 400 DPI and 8 by 8 inches, or, that's fine. You can bring it down to 300 later. Don't go so ridiculously high, though, that you make your computer hate you. Like, Photoshop will not like you if you're drawing at 600 DPI or higher. But I think Brad will chime in on that one and say you want to set up the files right. Don't you think, Brad?
You can do 600 DPI if you're just doing black and white with no gray.
That's very true. Yes.
That's fine. But most of us are, probably aren't doing that. So then you go back to that 300, 400 DPI and always plan for print. Always, always, always plan for print, because it's going to be an eventuality. Now, I'm going to break with Dave a little bit, because he said get it up on the web, and that implies a website. And right now, we've got a lot of questions that I've put on hold, saying, what's the best CMS? What's the best content management system? Should I be using Comic Easel? Should I be using something else? Which is a whole nother conversation we're going to get to.
Right.
Right now, there is no good choice. Comic Easel has fallen way behind. I love Comic Easel. I've used it always. But right now, the perfect webcomics content management system has to do the following. It has to give a full page or a full strip to the person coming on a desktop, and it's got to give a vertical scroll similar to the Webtoons layout for somebody on a mobile phone. Now, Philip Hofer will immediately point out that you can do this in Comics Easel. However, it's a process, and it's up on webcomics.com if you want to find it. It's about 12 or 14 steps, and it is a ridiculous amount of trouble that you've got to go through to make this thing happen. I am currently working with somebody to launch a content management system. And when I say launch, they're doing all the work. I'm giving them information and giving them advice.
I like it. And when I say we're ready to launch, they're doing all the work and I'm writing them a check. So that's
right. That's kind of true too. But when that's ready, and it's going to be maybe in a few months, it dovetails with everything I've been talking about on this show for literally years. It's going to have Patreon integration and so on and so forth. This is going to be hopefully the solution to what I see as a huge problem. Now, having said that, what are you going to do? I'm going to say first, start putting your stuff out on social media. Start putting it out on Twitter, start putting it out on Facebook and Instagram, particularly Instagram,
Mhm.
and start gauging the response. Now, eventually, you need to set up a website. But the advice that I've been giving young people recently has been not necessarily to start with a website, but to start for a few months and put yourself out on social media and start to gauge the response you're getting there. Keep that stuff, be ready to launch a website, but it's not necessarily going to be the first thing you do. Uh, it's going to be an eventuality, it's going to be a necessity, but it's not the first thing you do. What do you think about that approach, Dave?
I
Because
think
it's
that's
different.
I think that's smart. I also would say that if Susan is sharing it on social media, which I'm totally fine with, don't forget, Susan, to register your URL that you are going to want. Um,
Yeah.
you're going to want to get that now, and you're going to want to eventually start building all of your world around that URL and pointing
Hmm.
things to that URL. So yeah, go with the low hanging fruit now. Both Brad and I recognize that starting a comic process, the exciting part of it is putting pen to paper, right? So do that first and make the programming down the road. I think I'm fine with that, and Brad's fine with that. And
Yeah.
use social media. Let that do the heavy lifting at first. Um, and then you also had a question nestled among the 48 questions there, Susan. Don't think we're not on to you, Susan. You snuck 28 questions in there. You said, "How do I do both vertical and full page format?" Well, that raises some considerations that you'll want to take into account as you design your page, which is
Mhm.
if you can think of a Marvel layout, a Marvel or DC Comics layout. Sometimes you'll have those really strongly vertical panels
Mhm.
nestled next to 2 or 3 square panels that like fill up the rest of the space, right? Sometimes you'll have this really long horizontal panel on a DC page,
Yeah.
right? What I'm getting at is if you know that you're going to be slicing up your comic to be presented both vertically and as a full page, requires certain accommodations to the fact that if you draw a really strongly horizontal panel, that's going to look stupid and read really small
Yeah.
on a vertical format. So what I'm getting at is you're probably going to cheat towards squarish panels so that they
Yeah.
can be sliced up and presented both vertically and in a page or in, God forbid, even in a horizontal format if you wanted to. And so when I say square, I don't necessarily mean a perfect square. I just mean it's going to be square-ish, somewhat
Mhm.
rectangular, squarish, so that it can be presented in both formats. Don't you think, Brad?
Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be really important that you do that, especially if you're going to start putting the stuff up on Webtoons, which is also an option that's available to you. And again, I'm a big proponent of Webtoons, not as my main site, but as a mirror site. And if you're doing this with the idea of launching that website a little bit later, then that's fine. That's absolutely fine. You get the best out of doing that. The other nice thing about this social media first approach is that you don't feel quite so locked in. In other words, if you go and do your comic for a little while and decide, okay, I'm gonna take another pass at this. I've learned a bunch of things. I might want to restart this. You don't feel like there's like an existing archive or record of what you've done. All of that stuff is kind of like gone. It's
Right,
forgotten
right.
very quickly. And so that gives you the idea of starting this out on social media. It's almost like doing your initial building in the sand. You know that the next tide is going to wash it away, and that's okay because you're really starting out. You're just learning. So I wouldn't even want you fettered by the idea of an archive. You could have you might end up keep going and do this for 3 years starting on the day that you started it, or you might want to kind of retool and regroup. Starting on social media gives you the ability to do all of that.
Right. Well, I think that's a good enough button. I think
Yeah.
both Brad and I would wish you well. It's exciting to read a question that has that kind of like, I'm excited to go. Put me in,
Yeah.
coach. And so we wish you well, Susan, as you start with that. And the next question, Brad, comes in from Nathaniel Gold over at patreon.com/ComicLab. And this one specifically jumps off of something you've apparently said, Brad. So let's read
Oh,
this one.
let's hear what I said.
Brad, you have mentioned before on this podcast that your first comic should be rebooted after a year. I don't remember that, but we'll see.
Wait a minute. What did I say?
Question. Well, I'll read it again. Brad, you have mentioned before on this podcast that your first comic should be rebooted after a year. My question is, how do you recommend rebooting it if it's a short form strip? Start from scratch, redo your best strips, or simply just keep going? After rebooting, would you take the old stuff off your site and social media accounts or make new ones? Brad, I got to say, I have known you for the better part of 20 years. I don't know that you have ever advocated for that.
This scares me so much because not only do I disagree with it, but it's what it is. It's a misunderstanding of something that I think is really, really important. So
Right.
I want to make sure that I take some time and clarify this. At no point have I ever said that you should do a comic and then after 12 months, that's it, reboot it. What I did say is if you're having trouble, if it's not getting traction, don't stay with a mistake just because you took a long time to make it.
Oh,
In other words,
yes.
you should give yourself the option of rebooting but not after a year, maybe after 6 months, maybe after 3 years. In other words, I want you to keep that as an option that's available to you. But at no point have I ever said that you should reboot your comic after a year. Okay,
Well, yeah.
that's not what I said.
In fact, I think to argue from what Nathaniel's coming at here, maybe what Nathaniel heard was that we had said, because I remember us saying, if you constantly reboot or retread or go back and fix, quote unquote, whatever was broken,
Right.
you're not moving forward. You're just going back over like maybe I do it this way. No, that didn't work. Maybe I do it this way. No, that didn't work. Like you've got to move forward. Like in moving forward is progress. And going back. Now, having said that, I do remember, like Brad said, that there are times where just because you've made a mistake doesn't mean you should keep doing it just because it took you a long time to do it. I do know that was the case.
Right.
But that's different than advocating for an active choice to like, well, it's been 11 months and 31 days. I guess it's time for me to reboot.
Yeah.
I think both of us would say like the best solution for any faults that you perceive at the beginning of your story is to keep going and make it better and better, right?
Mhm.
Now, both Brad and I have on some way, shape, or form rebooted or reformed our storytelling,
Oh,
both
yeah.
with Evil Inc. and with Drive. So it's not that we're proponents of never doing it. I think it's just that it's the attitude of like, well, it's 12 months, got to do it. Like that's, if you're fine with the first year, if you're fine, when you get to year 5, you're like, well, I like the first 5 years. I was growing the whole time and getting better. Then leave it. Just leave it. That's fine. That's fine.
Right.
No one's, it's only the nature of like, you know what, since we talked about Peanuts, I bet if Schultz could go back and redo that first Peanuts, he would have done it. But he grew up in an age where it's not like people were going back and rereading that first one.
Right.
Wednesdays followed Tuesdays followed Monday, you know, that kind of thing. So, like Brad mentally had to
your order.
you had to check the math on that. What I'm getting at is because everything we ever created lives online and is in our archives, we feel this sort of artist guilt about like, oh, I wish I could go and redo that number one. And I get that. I have walked that path, so I get that. But what I'm saying is don't feel as though what's keeping your career from growing is the number one. What's holding you back or jettisoning you forward is your ability and energy and humor that you're putting into your comic now, you know, or go ahead, Brad, but you probably have a better way to say that.
Well, so what the bottom line is that there's no one size fits all solution to this, right?
Yeah.
There's not like an automatic reboot after a year. But really what we're saying is give yourself I would keep a reboot in my bag of tricks, right?
Right,
And
right.
as Dave says, to be used, maybe once or twice over the course of your career.
Right. Right.
But could hang with it and don't get really upset because you can kind of get caught into a loop. I've rebooted twice with my central comic. Grace Tune In was rebooted as Evil Inc., and then Evil Inc. was rebooted from a comic strip to a graphic novel, right? Which was a very serious reboot because it changed how I did everything.
Right.
But along the way, there was a bunch of stuff that, like Dave said, I wished I could change. Now, to the second part of the question. How do you recommend doing it if it's a short form strip? Start from scratch, redo your best strip, simply keep going, take all your stuff off social media. That's a question that I can't possibly answer for you because that's your decision to make, number one. And it's the decision that you're going to make based on why you rebooted in the first place, right?
Yeah.
It's not, I can't give you a flat, here's what you should do. It's going to be the result of a conversation that you have with yourself about why you're rebooting in the first place. What problem are you trying to solve?
Right.
Once you know that, then you know how all of this other stuff should go down.
Yeah, and I will jump in and say, like, when on the specific question about should I take things off social media, like the older version of the comic, should I take that off
Yeah,
social media?
yeah.
I will say a lot of that question is platform specific. No one is going like, I wonder what Brad Geiger was tweeting about in 2005. Like, no
No,
one's going
unless they're
back.
trying to dig up dirt or something,
Right.
that
Like, no one's going back and actively looking at Dave Kellett's Twitter feed from 2005, right? No one cares. So leave Twitter alone. It's fine. It's not going to, only
Mhm.
because what a waste of time.
Yeah,
I mean, you can delete it if you want, but what a waste of time. Now, I will say Instagram is a very different platform. And people, if I do like a Brad Geiger comic from today, I'll sometimes go, hey, I'd like to read 5, 10, 20 more of those. And so you scroll down in Brad's, Instagram feed. And so there, again, it's your consideration of whether the old stuff negates the new stuff or the old stuff is fighting against the new stuff. I would probably argue for just leaving it alone. But
yeah,
if you feel like you really want a fresh start, then sure, by all means, go ahead and delete the old stuff. But I
yeah.
I don't think you have to, right, Brad? Is that a fair way to
No,
say
there's
it?
no reason to do any of that. Let that stuff filter to the bottom of the tank. It's not. It's literally not worth the time that you're going to put into doing a
Yes.
search and destroy and getting rid of all that stuff. And in a weird way, this kind of dovetails with the previous question. It's part of the reason that for Susan, I suggested that she do those early strips and just put them on social media to get her initial response from it. Because then if she goes down the road for a little while and decides, oh, I learned a lot of stuff, I got a lot of good feedback from the people that were reading on social media, I'm gonna make some changes and relaunch. And now you've got a guilt-free, easy way to do that. And
Right.
you've been building an audience online that is going to be ready to see this new polished up version.
But I feel like a part of me, Brad, feels like we a little bit made a hash of this question at the beginning.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to make a fresh start of this. Like,
Okay.
let's come at this from a fresh angle. Okay, so you've been drawing for a while now, and you're feeling like, okay, I'm a better artist now. I'm a better writer now. I'm a better storyteller. And I
Right.
look back at the older stuff, and it's not representative of what I want to be right now, what I want to do right now, right?
Hmm.
And this is a feeling that is universal. We have all had this.
Yeah.
So neither Brad nor I would advocate that you have to reboot, have to refresh, have to start over. But knowing that that happens for all of us at some point, to Brad's point, do it a couple times at best over a 10, 20, 30 years career, once or twice over that time.
Hmm.
And then when you do it, uh, this is the part that I think we haven't talked about. How best, Brad, to do it? In general, do you delete all that stuff from the archives? Do you acknowledge that it still exists, but like maybe make a note, hey gang, we're starting fresh? How would you do that? Like it's on your site, not social media, on your site, Brad.
Again, I'm gonna dig my heels in. It's gonna be dependent upon why you're rebooting in the first place.
Okay.
You
Okay.
know, I can't give you a one size fits all on that because it's way too complicated. In some cases, so for Evil Inc., I wanted those comics in the archives, partially because I was making ad revenue, partially because that the reboot was a really soft reboot, and all of that content was still worthwhile for audience building.
Right.
Now, if I had a little bit different situation and I was completely doing like redoing everything, and that early stuff that I had done was a detrimental, then I search and destroy.
Well, Brad, let me ask you, do we have any kind words this week?
Oh, that's right. It's time for thanks for the kind words. And Dave, if you haven't read this one on Apple Podcasts yet, this came along with a 5-star review. And if you haven't read this yet, it is, I swear to goodness, it's gonna make your day. Listen to this. This comes in from Jesse and Press, who says, "Thank you. The reason I titled this review Thank You is because as a child, I wanted nothing more than to do a comic strip. But somewhere around my 20s, my spirit was broken, and I hid in a dark corner of the world denying that I was ever going to be good enough to be a cartoonist. Then at 40, I picked up my pen and began to publish my first comic, Ike and Joe. And one of the main differences in my life between then and now was ComicLab. What I learned from Dave and Brad is simply that time is a continuum. And you can't get worse at something you do every day.
Oh.
In some strange way, listening to them felt as if they were giving me permission to be a cartoonist, which I realized I had the power to give myself the whole time.
Right.
I look forward to what the future holds for my cartooning. Thank you, Brad and Dave. It is an honor to listen to you each week and to support you on Patreon.
Wow, that's lovely. That was really lovely.
Yeah, that's gonna keep me going for a long time. Like every now and again, I know you do the same thing. Sometimes when you're kind of feeling a little bit down, you look at some of those ratings on iTunes, and that is an instant pick me up. Just the thought that we took somebody, or we were able to help somebody realize that there's nothing stopping you from doing this. Put that thing out there and enjoy yourself. And see where it takes you. You know, there's nothing stopping you. Go out there and do it.
Yeah, and what a nice thing. We should probably just reinforce that by saying, no matter where you are in your life, comics are a wonderful path that you can walk, even in the side alleys of your life. Like, do you have to keep a daytime job? No problem. Comics can be done on nights and weekends. Do you have a family or responsibility that you have to take care of? No problem. When they go to sleep, that's your time to shine. You know, like, you can find a way to get it in the nooks and crannies of your life and still get a lot of joy out of it. So this email means a lot. And the fact that someone was perhaps a little self-negating in their 20s and now is allowing that joy in of comics, how wonderful is that, Brad?
Yeah, it's just a constant reminder. It's never too late. I think a lot of people get into that mindset where they're like, well, I should have done this in my 20s and I didn't, and now I'm 40 and you know, it's too late. Well, that's bupkis. You know, there's nothing to that. You can start in your 40s, you can start in your 50s. I want to hear from a 70-year-old that just picked up the pen and decided, doggone it, I'm going to give this a shot. I want to read that comic.
Well, and I don't want to sound like Pollyanna-ish about it, but
yeah,
I've been doing this a while, but I still think the best cartoonist that I'm going to be is a few decades ahead of me. I feel like
I think so too.
Hope springs eternal with me in terms of like, oh, I'm definitely going to get better. I don't know how good I'm going to get. Wait a minute. Were you taking a shot? I didn't even see that coming in. Oh man, I was being so rosy cheeked about it. I didn't even see Brad slip that in. That was amazing. Yeah, we're all hoping that too, Dave. We're all hoping that too.
Your best days have got to be ahead of you.
Well, Lord knows we've seen the worst, so it's got to be ahead of you, right?
I'm doubling up on the kind words, but I also got, by the way, you're going to love this. Somebody wrote in, I forget which pathway it took, but they said, I think they're from Great Britain, I think. Okay. Or I don't want to guess because I'm probably going to get it wrong. But anyway, they weren't from Ohio, let's put it this way. And this guy says, I love the way you and Dave take the mickey out of each other.
Yeah, that's definitely Great Britain in some way, shape, or form.
Have you ever heard that idiom before? Take the mickey out?
Take the mickey. I've heard that one. Another Britishism is to take the piss out of each other.
Yeah.
Which is also a great phrase because, like, work backwards on that one. How did that phrase get created? Take the piss out of someone. But yeah, you and I, like, it's also, God forbid, if you're going to be a cartoonist, have the ability to laugh at yourself and have joy in your heart. This is a career where, even if you're telling somber stories, what a joy-filled art this can be. And so I'm glad that comes through in the show. And thank you again for the kind words and for the 5-star rating over at iTunes. That means a lot. And it also means a lot, just so you know, not only for our hearts, but for whatever reason, Apple's algorithms, it helps kind of get the comic out or the podcast out to more people. So that's very nice of you. Thank you.
So the more you say that, the more I'm able to say you've been listening to ComicLab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my dear friend Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the cartoonist of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com.
And my dear, dear, dear friend.
All right, way to one-up me there, champ. Slow it down over there.
Dave, the best is yet to come, Kellett.
Oh, for goodness
The co-director of Stripped and the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com.
And the Comic Lab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton over at the delightful collection of his music, theworldrecord.net. And this episode was edited by Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
And if you love Comic Lab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, and you may hear your review featured on a future episode.
And Comic Lab is made possible by your support on patreon.com/comiclab. So we'll go ahead and say that twice. patreon.com/comiclab.
Ring, ring. That's a harp sound effect.
That's a
ring, ring. It is I, your archangel companion, Mr. Schultz. Is there anything you'd need today? Oh, what are you listening to?
Wait, what are we doing? What is
I'm the Listen, I'm the archangel who's companion. I set it all up in 3 fucking sentences. I'm the archangel.
I'm
a
yes-anding.
companion
Here's my
to
yes
Charles
and.
Schultz, and Charles Schultz is listening to a podcast. Take it.
I'm yes-anding. Yes, and what the hell are we talking about? All right, so I'm listening to a podcast called Comic Lab. They're talking about the 3 most important comics in history. So I'm very excited to hear how it's going to turn out here.
How delightful, Mr. Schultz. Bring. That's my harp still. Bring. Have they mentioned you yet?
I gotta tell you, I'm 25 minutes in. They have not mentioned Peanuts yet. I'm going to be honest. Wait, hold on. Where's the fast forward button here? Wait a minute. 30 minutes in, they finally mentioned Peanuts? Hold on.
Shall I have them smited?
I believe the past tense is smote. If you could have them.
I will. You're lucky I didn't say smitten. That would have taken this show into a completely different area.